Fantastic, thanks. As chair of the Plant Conservation Alliance Federal Committee, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Jared Margulies, Assistant Professor of Political Ecology in the Department of Geography at the University of Alabama. Political ecology is a diverse field that looks at environmental inequalities, human-nature relationships, and how contemporary social issues intersect with pressing environmental questions. Dr. Margulies held a postdoc at the University of Sheffield with the BioSec project, a 4-year research effort examining the global politics of biodiversity conservation, where he focused on illegal wildlife trade. Currently, he is pursuing 2 core areas of research: human-wildlife conflicts and the politics of conservation management in South India, work that was previously supported by a Fulbright Nehru grant, and studying the global illegal trade in cactus and succulent plants, which he's here today to discuss with us. So without further ado, Jared, I don't know if you want to grab the screen, or did you prefer for us to project your presentation?
Let me go ahead and try to make this happen.
Okay, so without further ado, speaking to us today about the illicit succulent plant trade and pathways towards sustainability, I'd like to welcome Dr. Margulies. I give you the floor.
Okay, thank you so much, Patricia, for that introduction. Can you see my first slide now?
Yes.
Okay, fabulous. Okay, good, it's working. So thank you all so much for the opportunity to be here with you. It's both very humbling and also a real honor to get to speak with so many experts in the field of plant conservation, and all the more so because so many of the people actually on this call were not only vital to me beginning this research, but key interlocutors during my research process. So this is also a really rare opportunity for someone in my position as a social researcher to really feed back the kind of research in progress as I'm doing it and hear from you. And I look forward to our question and answer session. And I, of course, if that needs to extend into other fora and have conversations via email, I'd be very happy to hear from everybody. So before I begin, I would also just like to say thank you very much again to Patricia, but also to Gary Krupnick of the National Museum of Natural History in DC for inviting me on behalf of the speaker planning team for PCA to talk with you all today about the illegal wildlife trade in succulent plants. Gary and I met, as he mentioned, a few years ago when him and his colleagues in the herbarium at the National Museum of Natural History graciously tolerated a social scientist wandering around their herbarium for a couple of months, asking probably very stupid or simple or strange sounding questions to them. So I just want to thank you so much for your tolerance for putting up with me there. So the title of my talk today is Illicit Succulent Plant Trade and Pathways Towards Sustainability. And I want to take a moment as I get into this to provide just a bit of broader context about illegal wildlife trade in plants and the persistence of inattention to plants within the broader fora of IWT. That's going to be the acronym I use for illegal wildlife trade in the talk today, but IWT policy, funding, and also research. One of the challenges remains the fact that outside of trade in things like valuable timber species, there really is a sort of serious lack of research on the subject of IWT in plants. And so to provide a little bit of context for that, I do want to share a few snippets of sort of disparate information that point to just some of the ways in which plants remain relegated in discussions of IWT and conservation writ large compared to animals. I realize here I'm sort of speaking to the choir, so I'm going to not spend and dwell too much on this. But I do want to highlight the ways that there's good evidence that plant IWT is both globally significant and directly impacting species conservation. And this slide is just a signal that I, along with a number of other colleagues, have also done some writing and reviewing of this problem of the sort of persistence of inattention to plants in IWT. So this is just sort of a slide of a grab bag of kind of signals of ways in which IWT in plants is both global, pervasive, and yet remains poorly characterized and understood. So for instance, just by way of example, in terms of the kind of challenges that are presented by plant IWT, we know, for instance, that nearly 30,000 species of plants are listed on the CITES convention, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Fauna and Flora, compared to about 6,000 species of animals. This isn't to suggest that plants are in any way more important in terms of thinking about their illicit trade or international trade, but to highlight the sort of scale and volume of scope of species that we're dealing with. In terms of thinking about this from the perspective of volume, between 2005 and 2014, 35% of all seizures recorded in the UNODC World Wildlife Seizures Database were rosewood species, representing the highest proportion of all wildlife recorded as seized in the database. And more germane to my talk today, it's estimated that 31% of all cactus species are threatened with extinction, and 47% are impacted by collection for the horticulture trade, much of which is illegal. And this is from the review of the by Dr. Barbara Getch and her colleagues with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And I think Barbara might actually be on this call, which is great. And so these are just a couple of examples of both thinking about the sort of scale of the problem in the ways that this general neglect of plant illegal wildlife trade is so pressingly urgent because of the direct and immediate consequences for plant species, their endangerment, and their conservation that it holds. Just by way of example, two of the most threatened taxonomic groups on Earth, including animal taxa, are cycads and cacti, both of which experience serious and sustained threats from illegal wildlife trade. So these are real and immediate threats to species extinction. But in putting this bullet point list together, I also want to point out the various signals about the problems we have in terms of information and knowledge, in terms of how it's both patchy and lacking. So this isn't to say that there aren't people who've been doing research on various forms of illegal plant trade for some time. This is especially true in the context of orchid trade as well as the timber sector. But this work is also often very site-specific and often more focused on characterizing the presence of illicit trades in specific species rather than the social or economic dimensions of what is driving them or how such trades function or circulate. And this was sort of more where I was trying to develop some kind of intervention. Within that context and in the spirit of collaboration, I will also add that there are other efforts that are currently ongoing related to research to try to better understand and find ways of intervening in forms of global illegal plant trade. One being the project known as FloraGuard, which is led by Dr. Anita Lavorgna at the University of Southampton with a number of other colleagues in the UK. And that's a project where they're really looking into online methods of combating plant trade online. Another recent project being approached from a more critical criminological perspective is led by Doctors Donna Yates and Simon McKenzie and Annette Hublich and this is a European Research Council funded project, and they're looking at the intersections of what they're calling criminogenic collectibles, which includes both succulents as well as cultural objects and fossils. And again, this is just for me to signal that I am one of a number of researchers around the world who are concerned and thinking about ways of developing more research about plant IWT. So with some of that background context out of the way, I want to move on to talking about how I actually arrived at the study of illicit succulent plant trade briefly, and how in particular I've chosen to research it. Because
Jared, can I just ask you a question?
Yes.
Is it possible to make your screen larger?
Oh, is it small?
It is kind of, but I don't know. It's
Did that just get bigger?
it got a little bigger. Yeah.
Do you want
That's
to, can I make
even,
it, should I make it more?
so that is better. If it can go bigger, great, but I don't want to ruin it. It's just, it is kind of hard to see some of the,
Oh, I apologize.
That's okay. Sorry.
Is that better?
Yeah, I think that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me see if I can do a little more. Sorry about technology issues here. How's that?
Yeah, that helps. Oh yeah.
Okay, great.
Yep. Thank you.
Sorry about that, folks. Apologies. Okay, so I do want to give a little bit of context for how I got into all of this. because I think it also speaks to a point I'll raise later about the importance of effective communication and reporting on IWT and the sort of challenges that come with doing so. So again, my background is as a human environment geographer. And so after I finished my PhD, I moved on to a postdoc at the University of Sheffield. And this was a project funded by the European Research Council, looking at the intersections of IWT, biodiversity conservation, and security. And so I decided I really wanted to focus on a trade where I could put more of my kind of ethnographic research experience to work, and where I felt like there were some very important and major knowledge gaps in terms of understanding the sort of character of these trades. And so I began to search for a form of understudied IWT, but where I felt I could not only pursue research to fill a particular kind of gap in research that might inform policy, but one where I could really meaningfully get up close to the trade itself and to understand how it functioned on the ground. And in the hopes of doing that, to also see how that might shed light on the functioning of other kinds of illicit trades in wildlife. So around this time, I came across an article about saguaro poaching in Mexico and Arizona. It wasn't this particular article, but it's a nice illustration of the problem. And so I read about saguaro poaching or cactus rustling, and it struck me as both so surprising and strange. It was something I had never thought about. I had never come across it. And I was really intrigued. It made me ask basic questions about why is there an illicit trade in succulent life at all in the first place? But I also didn't feel that saguaros were a broad enough subject to focus on for a 3-year research effort. And so, but eventually through reading other media articles online and in specialized forums, I came to learn about the illegal trade in all kinds of succulent life. And I just became really enraptured and almost enamored in the subject. And I just found it really fascinating. And I continue to feel that way to this day. Oops, let's see here. So I eventually got connected with Dr. Barbara Getch of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and a number of other colleagues, and eventually came to realize that despite this sort of grave concern that illegal collection in trade represented a dominant driver of cactus extinction amongst other succulent species, there was very little research on the problem, to say nothing of the kind of in-depth social research of the kind that I was interested in pursuing. And so this led me to ultimately develop some guiding research questions. So first, how do rare and threatened species enter illicit markets and circulate as commodities? Who are succulent collectors? And what motivates certain collectors to possess rare or threatened plants, especially wild harvested ones? How effective are international trade regulations like CITES in curbing illicit succulent trade? And where is demand for illicit succulents? And what is revealed through attention to both supply and demand side drivers of these trades? So in the end, these questions, with the support of the Biosec project, took me to 7 countries as indicated by my very sophisticated map here, where I've since conducted over 100 in-depth interviews with stakeholders ranging from law enforcement agents to scientists, many of whom are, I think, on this call right now, which is fantastic, agency specialists, in cactus and succulent growers and dealers at all kinds of scales, as well as passionate hobbyists and collectors, as well as a variety of individuals that intersect with illicit trades in these species of interest. So I want to make it clear up front also, though, that in trying to answer these research questions, it would be really impossible to give adequate coverage to all of the various places in the world that are impacted by illicit succulent trade, and I could not have reasonably followed these species to all their various final destinations. So I just am trying to acknowledge here there's also gaps in this study. So for instance, by looking at this map, we can see, for instance, that there's a major gap in terms of my research not focusing on the succulents of southern Africa, for instance, lithops and conophytum species that are increasingly targeted by plant poachers. In saying that, though, I was rather intentional in the design of my study and where I was trying to focus my efforts. So for instance, if we just look at proportions of species that are threatened, this is just within the cactus family, and species richness, I was specifically targeting areas, one, on the sourcing side, that are areas of high degrees of species richness and endemism, but from a perspective of demand, I really wanted to pay attention to places of demand. And so this is important because it also moved my study away from the global south and towards the global north, namely towards the United States, the United Kingdom, and Europe, and eventually South Korea as well. So often in discussions about IWT, and this is something I'll also return to at the end of my talk, there's almost this monopolized focus on China and other East and Southeast Asian countries as drivers of illegal wildlife trade. And despite strong empirical evidence that the United States and Europe remain centers of global wildlife trade writ large, both as sources of wildlife for global trades, as well as centers of wildlife consumption. And the same goes for succulent plant trade as well. And these are just a couple of screenshots of some examples of articles that have highlighted and assessed the degree to which these trades do circulate in where demand is produced, both within Europe and the United States. Okay, so before I move on to the sort of specific case study of Dudleya farinosa, which I think is part of why a number of folks are here today, I did want to give a sort of broader, more concrete sense of my broader project, which will ultimately take the form of my in-progress book on illicit succulent trade, which I'm currently writing. So to do this, I want to give an example of just a specific cactus and how it illicitly entered the global marketplace, and why social research is so vital for understanding the complexities of global illegal trade in succulents, as it is any form of wildlife. I think this particular cactus also exemplifies what makes responding to plant IWT so challenging for law enforcement, bureaucratic, and agency from those perspectives of bureaucracies and agencies, especially due to the kinds of regulatory mechanisms that currently exist, and also because of the particular challenges that plants themselves pose compared to animals in combating illegal trade. I think this example also highlights at the same time why cultures of plant collecting are really essential to confronting those challenges if the aim is to reduce or eliminate these forms of trade. So my example focuses on the cactus species Mammillaria bertholdii, the people who stole it from outside a small village in the Mixtec territory of Oaxaca, and the kinds of people who are really desirous to possess it. So this is a species that you can see here, has these interesting tiny feathery spines. It has, which is a quite unusual trait within the cactus family. It has a relatively deep taproot, which helps it survive in more prolonged droughts in the Oaxacan drylands. It has cryptocarpic fruits, which means that, as the name suggests, the seeds are really embedded in the body of the plant and require sort of tweezers, for instance, for collectors to pull them out. And these are all quite unique features. The plant you're looking at here on the left is a grafted plant. So the top of it is Bertholdii, and it's grafted onto a faster growing rootstock to make it grow faster. And then this is what it looks like when grown, when it's growing in habitat. I'm mentioning these unique features because it's part of the uniqueness of the cactus that makes it so desirable to collectors. So this cactus is known to only exist in around 10 square kilometers in the state of Oaxaca. I say known because there's actually relatively little scientific knowledge about this species. It was first, quote unquote, discovered by the self-described German cacto explorer Andreas Berthold in 2013, for whom the plant is now named, and it was formally described in the literature by Thomas Linsen, who's another German. But almost immediately after its description in the published literature, seeds in small grafted stock of these rare plants were already for sale online and at major cactus conventions in Europe. Given its relatively slow growth as a plant, these plants and seeds were certainly illegally smuggled out of Mexico years before the species was described in the literature, suggesting that even those who first removed it were aware of this new species before it was ever formally discovered. So this is to say that it's entirely possible that people had already found this plant, illegally extracted it from Mexico, and were simply waiting for it to be formally described in the literature before putting it out on the market to sell. There are only so many ways that one can illegally ship a tiger cub from one destination to another and have it arrive still alive. The same limitations, however, don't hold for plants, no less ones that have adapted to survive in these kind of extreme dryland conditions. So in this way, I'm also theorizing succulents' lootability. And by this, I mean their unique characteristics and traits that make them especially vulnerable to illicit extraction, transit, and trade, often at great distances and over long durations of time. In terms of Bertholdii, its sale outside of Mexico was and remains to this day in effect illegal because the entire family of Cactaceae is listed on CITES. This is enlisted as an Appendix 2 plant. They require import or export permits. And as many are probably aware, Mexico made the decision to list all seeds from Mexican cacti on CITES as well about 20 years ago. So this means that with few exceptions, any cactus or its seed leaving Mexico requires a permit. The CITES trade database contains no record of wild or artificially propagated Bertholdii ever being exported from Mexico, however. So just a few years ago, grafted specimens of this species were purportedly being sold for over $1,000 or more per individual plant, though these prices have since come down and now range from anywhere between $10 to $100 per plant, almost exclusively on the kind of stock you see pictured here on this, this eBay ad from a plant being sold from the Ukraine. The first seeds were sold from online commercial growers for about $50 for a packet of 10 seeds from the Czech Republic. And purportedly, these were from grafted plants, but they were also quite possibly from plants extracted from the wild. According to scientists and amateur botanists, the greatest threat in habitat this Bertholdii now faces is from illicit collection. So I've already summarized why Bertholdii made such a splash in the community when it did. This was sort of described by a contemporary British cactus grower and collector named Graham Charles, who wrote that it's always exciting when a really sensational new cactus is found and named. The description of Bertholdii in the German Mammillaria Journal is one of those moments. And so there are many kinds of collectors, though in my experience to date, there are more male than female collectors, especially within the United States and Europe, and they tend to skew from middle-aged to elderly, and collectors tend to specialize or focus their collections in a particular way. The collecting community in Europe and the United States is also a majority, though by no means exclusively white demographic. And I mention these demographics because they mirror the broader social psychology literature on collectors writ large and their population demographics. There are lots of different definitions of collecting, which social psychologists differentiate as unique from activities of accumulating, possessing, hoarding, or investing. Collecting is not a random activity, even if it may be arbitrary what structures a particular collection. And so ultimately, following the material culture scholar Susan Pierce, we can say that a collection is what a collector ultimately believes it is. So there's many ways that collectors structure their collections. But when Bertholdii was discovered, it was so unusual, there was an immediate and intense demand for it across the hobby. It more or less checked all of the boxes for the mechanisms by which cactus, we can say, elicit the desire of the collector. It was rare in the wild, unusual in shape, and it featured this beautiful large magenta flower and unusual morphological features. And importantly, it was new. So to say that it was desirable and charismatic is an understatement. And so while just a few years ago, it reached some very impressive valuations on the international or gray market, black or gray market, within a short period of time, its price fell to anywhere between $5 to $30 for a grafted plant or so. The people who stole Bertholdii out of Mexico tell me that they are responsible for this rapid price crash. And they fancy themselves what I'm describing and theorizing as quote unquote Robin Hood conservationists. So through active seed germination and propagation of stolen plant material, prior to the plant's debut in the scientific literature, they developed a stock of young seedlings ready to be sold to meet the demand produced by their Bertholdii mania that swept the international cactus collecting community. As one collector put it, if not for us, this plant might already be extinct in the wild, and yet we are made out as criminals. So these are the same people who Mexican conservation officials tell me are smugglers, thieves, and cactus profiteers. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that they aren't. But the point is that the people who smuggled Bertholdii out of Mexico see themselves in certain ways as conservationists, responsible for preventing its extinction. And this highlights the need for attention to the social and psychological dimensions mediating illegal cactus trade. So for instance, these are people who see themselves as sort of the quote unquote bad boys of cactus conservation, going by such names as the gorilla cactus group. And they justify illicit behavior by answering to what Mackenzie and Yates have referred to as a higher loyalty, in the sense that they see themselves as on the wrong side of what they see as a misguided bureaucratic approach to saving these species. So just to conclude this section, I realize what I'm presenting here is really only a teaser of the bigger project I'm working on, but I hope it signals in certain ways why attention to the social as well as psychological becomes valuable, a form of research in contending with the impacts of IWT in plant life, and why this is the direction I've chosen to pursue. So I'm just going to take a sip of water real quick. I want to now turn to a different and more specific case study, and one that I think also highlights the importance of social research in the field of IWT, but I think also raises other important forms of problems and complexities. It likely is also a story that perhaps more of you are familiar with, given a sort of the variety of splashy media headlines and attention that this particular story has received over the last couple of years. To briefly summarize this trade for those who are less familiar with it, beginning in around 2017, California Department of Fish and Wildlife officials became aware of a growing problem of Dudleya farinosa poaching by foreign nationals in multiple, apparently unrelated incidents that continue to grow in their sort of magnitude and scope. In particular, several groups of predominantly South Korean foreign nationals were apprehended in the United States for either shipping or attempting to ship out hundreds to thousands of Dudleya farinosa plants. While various theories within the popular press and amongst law enforcement officials offered explanations for the evidence of this and emergence of this new illegal trade to South Korea, to date there has been very little evidence presented explaining the foundational drivers of this trade, which is to say, why does this trade exist at all? Why were people stealing Dudleya farinosa from California? So Dudleya farinosa is a coastal dwelling species inhabiting a very narrow ecotone along steep coastal bluffs ranging from southern Oregon in the north as far as south as Santa Barbara in the south. I'm also well aware that there may be people on this call who are true experts in Dudleya farinosa, so I appreciate your generosity and patience in listening to a non-expert talk about this important plant. So it's normally presumed, as this screenshot I took from an online market site suggests, that economic gain is the foundational driver of most illegal trades in wildlife. And farinosas, if this screenshots like this are to be believed, are exceptionally so. So this is a plant here listed as being worth over $4,000, which would make it one of the most highly valued plants desired by collectors. Although I will say the fantastical world of aroid collectors and variegated monsteras seems to be quickly trying to catch up. But I want to complicate this narrative of approaching the motivation for farinosa poaching as simply rooted in economic gain. This isn't to say that money doesn't matter in understanding the trade, because of course it does. Opportunity for economic profit is essential to the trade, but attention only to the profit of individual actors willing to break the law doesn't help us set our sights on the more foundational sources of emergent illegal plant trades, namely those that actually desire them, so the demand side of this equation. So in presenting evidence for the motivations behind this trade, I want to critique some of the commonplace narratives about wildlife consumption patterns in East Asia, rooted in particular in stereotypes of Asian consumer habits in mainstream media that are also persistent within both the conservation and wildlife trade sectors. So I want to show not only how these stereotypes are powerful in their ability to frame media narratives, but they can also be misleading and therefore unhelpful, in addition to potentially problematic, in the absence of more critical evidence of what actually underpins specific forms of wildlife trade. So the case of Dudleya farinosa becomes a unique opportunity to explore an ongoing and poorly understood illegal wildlife trade. So this work for me is based on media content analysis and interviews I conducted up and down the California coast with California fish and wildlife officials, conservationists, and botanists. And so coming from the sort of California side of this research, there sort of appear to be two primary hypotheses as to why this trade emerged. And I'm going to sort of describe them as such. The first is sort of this idea of the increasing popularity of succulent plants in mainstream South Korean and East Asian cultures writ large. Okay. Um, so this is just the idea that sort of a mass interest in growth in mainstream consumer culture desiring succulents led to the rise in poaching of Dudleya farinosa. And the second idea was this hypothesis about the preferential valuing of wild versus cultivated plants by succulent consumers. So namely that this poaching was occurring because these plants were being valued specifically because they came from the wild and were wild plants rather than cultivated plants. So I wanted to interrogate these narratives in order to not just understand the motivations behind these trades, but to also understand how these narratives are operating in the world for whom they serve and also to what effect. So across dozens of interviews I conducted with experts and law enforcement agents, explanations for the emergence of this new illegal trade fell into three broad framings. The first was a simple profit frame, that plants were being stolen because people saw them as an easy way to make money. And of course, this is unambiguously true, but I wanted to know why make money in this particular way. Why not just, for instance, grow farinosa or in South Korea, or if you're interested in illicit activity, why not, for instance, get into the cocaine trade, which would be far more lucrative if exceedingly dangerous. So the second framing, though, we can call a kind of cultural argument, which goes something like Asian consumers of wildlife products value what is rare and what is wild. Okay, we're going to get into that a little bit more in a second. In the third, we can call a sort of what I would call a sort of pop culture, or what I'm referring to here as the housewives and hipsters frame. And this is a term I pulled from a couple of media articles, that fads can rapidly produce these quote unquote frenzies for particular products that swept across South Korea as well as East Asian society writ large. This idea that there was a mass consumer culture in which everybody suddenly wanted a Dudleya farinosa plant. And because of the lack of supply in Korea, this led to the poaching of them in California. So these are just a couple of examples of these framings from news media reporting at work. So I'll just work from top to bottom. The Chinese middle class, 430 million people strong today, expected to reach 700 million in the next decade, has huge and growing buying clout, and its impact on many wildlife species has been devastating, from African elephants to rhinos to pangolins and sharks. So we see here this narrative linking Dudleya farinosa poaching as a sort of natural conclusion of, one, the growing threat of a rising Chinese middle class and the size of the Chinese population, as well as tying it to this idea of the destruction of other forms of wildlife, specifically here, things that are both rare and endangered in the wild. In the second, in the Asian country, this being Korea, tending succulents has become a favorite pastime across generations, popular with everyone from harassed housewives to Generation Z hipsters. And with all things Korean, from fashion and music to food and soap operas, grabbing the popular imagination in China, the world's most populous nation has caught a massive dose of Dudleya fever. And lastly, just when you think you've heard it all, something comes along to top the you won't believe this list. Here's the latest. Plant smugglers from China and Korea are raping and pillaging fragile California coastline habitats, in some cases rappelling down ocean-facing cliffs to poach native succulents and ship them to Asia, particularly to Korea, where housewives place them on windowsills as status symbols. Here in particular, we see this very evocative sense of the kind of invasion of a foreign entity, quote unquote, raping and pillaging the fragile native California coastline, which has some quite problematic overtures to it. And so I'm happy to talk about this particular aspect of the research in terms of how some of these narratives so quickly drew on various ideas and stereotypes about East Asian consumption of wildlife products, and maybe we can get into it into the Q&A. If you're also interested, though, there is a lively exchange of articles by myself and some co-authors with some others about these questions of demand reduction campaigns, illegal wildlife trade, and framing of sort of narratives. These are just screenshots from those articles in the journal Geoform. But sort of back to getting to the Dudleyas, the point here is, if in fact it were true that these plants were being valued as wild plants, then there might be a very serious problem on our hands. This would mean that the greenhouse cultured plants grown here in the US or in China or Korea would do very little to drive down demand. And if the desire for farinosa was being driven by their sudden popularity in pop culture, then this would also, then on the good side, this could potentially be a doomed trade to begin with, as Dudleyas don't fare very well as houseplants in a vastly different climate like Korea and China. So the hope would be even though all these plants were stolen, they would all soon die on these windowsills and people would move on to wanting something else. That latter narrative, however, doesn't explain why people would go to such great lengths to steal farinosa from California if they could simply be grown in Korea or China from seed. This is not a newly discovered species, nor is it a CITES regulated plant. So ultimately, following on from my qualitative research in California on this trade, I ultimately decided I had to go to South Korea to better understand this trade and how it operated on the ground and what was truly driving this demand. And so building on a framework for motivations in the use of wildlife products that you see here, published by Laura Thomas Walters and a number of her colleagues, I set about to analyze how both collectors, greenhouse operators, and purveyors of Dudleya farinosa in Korea described their various motivations for possessing these plants compared to the media content analysis of news articles I conducted published about Dudleya farinosa in both Korea and English. And so here's a sort of very simple breakdown of what I found in terms of breaking down the sort of various motivations. And so what I found was that there was a much more narrow set of motivations for why Korean dealers and collectors said that Dudleya farinosa was valued in Korea and by their consumers compared to what was being described in the sort of media literature about what was driving this sort of demand. So the findings of this work, though, extend beyond presenting a mismatch of motivational codes between how dealers and collectors in Korea report about this versus the media. So as my interviews with research, my interview research in Korea demonstrated, while succulents writ large are indeed immensely popular in Korea, there is very little relationship between the overall popularity of succulents, the sort of same trend we see here in the United States and globally, and those whom specifically desired to possess Dudleya farinosa. So my interview subjects, including specialist dealers who only focus on Dudleyas and a few select other variety of groups, made it very clear that these are not the same consumer groups. Another piece of evidence came from my surveys of large succulent warehouses in Seoul. Dudleya farinosas are not readily available for commercial succulent dealers in retail outlets, nor are they desired by average succulent enthusiasts. So I went to these very large retail outlets where people could buy succulents of all kinds and almost never found Dudleya or Dudleya farinosa. And in fact, many of the dealers had never heard of them. They are, however, available from specialist greenhouses and online dealers who cater to much more skilled and advanced collectors. So despite the kind of common tropes in the media and in my interviews about Asian consumers valuing these as very rare and endangered species, the collectors and specialist growers I interviewed were nearly exclusively interested in their aesthetic qualities. So while some had some awareness of where these plants came from, their place of origin had very little relationship to their value. Many collectors were only vaguely aware of the plant's geographic origins, and this is decidedly different than many of the American and European collectors much of my other research focuses on, such as those I was discussing in relation to Mammillaria bertholdii, who do value plants ascribed with particular geographies or locational data. In some instances, collectors who pay much more for plants when they come with the geolocated information about specifically where the plant or its progeny came from. So in summary, growers of Dudleya in Korea are very skilled and cultivated with care. And these are specialist growers, and these plants were for a select advanced specialist grower market. The plants are not for the everyday succulent mass market. It is a much smaller expert market, and these are not novice care plants. They are finicky, and interviewees all agreed it would be very difficult to keep them as a common house plant. So with that said, it doesn't mean that there's an insignificant number of people who are expert growers of succulents. There are quite a few of them, a large community of them across East Asia. I also strongly suspect from my interviews and discussions that these prices for farinosa are crashing, at least to a point. So where 2 years ago farinosa might have sold for several $100s or even $1,000 for a very large and beautiful plant, these prices have fallen dramatically. Their continued presence in online markets at extremely elevated prices should not also be equated with their sale price. They are frequently listed as mere aspirational prices to draw consumer attention. So this point is relevant for studies looking at online marketplaces for wildlife trade and how we actually value how much people are willing to spend on these plants. So the thrust of what drove people to poach these plants relates to disjunctures between plant time and the capacity to meet demand. The in-country supply of plants could not be met by a domestic demand, which is to say there was a demand and no readily available supply. Today, however, a number of greenhouses in Korea are now specializing in growing Dudleyas as a result of this market interest. It simply took several years for the rate of plant growth in Korea to be able to catch up with that demand for them. And in the meantime, unfortunately, for California and these plants, poachers filled that gap. It's also important to note that most Korean specialist dealers don't just deal to Korean or Japanese collectors, but also predominantly to Chinese collectors who value Korean plant care skill. So in this way, we can understand, strangely, the value of these plants as coming from Korea, not California. So it's also worth noting that these plants aren't only going to China, they're also going to Europe and elsewhere. So we need to understand this as a truly global economy, and placing blame squarely on the Chinese or Korean obsession with succulents will not target the communities where behavior change is sought. So in concluding this section, I've complicated, not simplified this global trade, but I hope it becomes clear why social research is so vital to answering conservation problems about plant illegal wildlife trade. This means we need more rigorous social research incorporated into conservation projects from the outset, not just to ask predefined questions, but to consider also what sorts of questions we might ask. So quickly, because I know I'm out of time, I did just want to mention a couple of sort of future research directions and next steps in my research. So for instance, and I just want to point that out also because I realize that there's a variety of agencies and organizations on this call that might also be interested in some of this work and where it might go. So the first to say is that I have now completed several years of largely qualitative and ethnographic work on this subject. Based on a lot of that, I'm actually now rolling out a larger internet-based survey to query cactus and succulent collectors and hobbyists across multiple countries about international trade. And that's in collaboration with a colleague at the University of Oxford, Dr. Amy Hinsley, who's done a remarkable amount of work herself on illegal orchid and bear bile trades. In the meantime, I'm working to complete my book on the subject, which I'm hoping will see the light of day by 2023 or so. And I'm now looking to apply the insights of this project to other trades, especially ones closer to home here now that I'm based in Alabama, especially in the southeast east region, for instance, Venus flytrap poaching and potentially pitcher plant poaching as well. I'm also, I should mention, beginning a work in progress to do some pilot work with Abby Meyer, who I think happily is also on this call of the Botanic Gardens Conservation International on cycads, and specifically how we might leverage certification programs to potentially reduce the presence of wild harvested cycads in the US market. And lastly, I'm also interested in returning to Mexico to more closely look at US-Mexico trade in cactus and succulent species to develop a greater degree of precision in understanding what kinds of specific interventions might not only serve best to curb illicit trade, but also foster a truly sustainable one. So with that, I just want to thank all of you so much for your time. And in terms of the work in Korea, I do want to give a big shout out and thanks in particular to Dr. Gina Kwan and Jae-hoon Kim, and a sort of pre-pandemic version of myself pictured here. And if you're interested in this Dudleya work, it is now published in a peer review context in the journal Frontiers in Ecology and Evolution. And with that, I just need to provide some acknowledgement and many thanks for the many organizations that have helped fund this work. So thank you so much. And now I need to find out how to stop sharing my screen.
Actually, Jared, if you don't mind, keep that up for a minute while we do the Q&A, if you still
Sure.
can. Because I think some folks wanted your contact info, so that'll give them time to jot it down as well. And a quick question to you, when you put your name and introed yourself at the top of the chat box, did you put your email there too?
I did not. Let me put it in the chat as well.
Okay, that would be great. I'll start with the question that's in the chat box, and if other people have questions, you could raise your hand. Well, first of all, I'll say thank you, Jared, for a wonderful presentation. Very interesting. The first question is, you mentioned that the advertised prices are aspirational. Are there sources available for establishing average actual market prices? Can you share those sources?
That's a fantastic question. The answer, I unfortunately don't have a good answer to that question. I wish I could say I do. That data for me comes from my qualitative interviews with dealers in Korea who specifically told me that they will often list plants at elevated prices to sort of draw attention to them as showpieces, as a sort of spectacular thing that very rarely actually turns into a sale at those prices. Most of their more collectible and special plants and rare plants, especially the larger ones, they usually negotiate one-on-one with particular buyers or often middlemen who then will negotiate a price. So unfortunately, I don't have a better answer to that question, but it's a very good one.
Yeah, it wasn't interesting. It was actually one of my questions too, so I'm glad somebody else asked it. One of the comments in the chat box is whether or not the slides will be available, and yes, after about 1 to 2 weeks from today's presentation, we will make it available on the Plant Conservation Alliance meetings page, and we'll let everybody know who participated in the meeting today when it becomes available. Let's see, I have a question from Peggy Olwell.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. That was a great presentation. It's kind of a sad presentation in some way because I started my career with Fish and Wildlife Service, and I think we listed most of the cacti under the Endangered Species Act back in the 1980s or 70s. I can't even remember, and we're working on things. And one of the things that, I mean, everything you had to say was what they were saying back 35 to 40 years ago in terms of preference for wild versus cultivated, but we never actually thought that the mass consumer wanted that. I didn't think they were what we saw in the cactus community at that point in time was that it was the very elite collectors that wanted the wild, and it was these cactus and succulent societies. It was the rules and regs and what they had on their annual meetings that were really pushing the wild collected stuff, because they were getting, prizes and awards for the biggest, the best. And of course, these things were, it was because of them collecting them from the wild that they were the biggest and the best, as opposed to growing. So I'm curious, with all of that background, I'm curious whether there's been any change in these cactus and succulent societies, because we tried to get the rules and regs, and as a federal government land managing agency, we cannot be we don't have the botanists, we don't have the law enforcement, we don't have people that even know how to identify this stuff to know whether it's valuable in terms, or that it's been illicitly collected. So I'm curious if you were able to talk to these associations and see if they've changed their rules, and if they're trying to be self-policing.
Yes, fantastic question. Thank you for asking it, because I didn't have a chance to really get into that very much during the talk. But that kind of community space of the kind of cactus societies is very much a major part of my research effort. It's so in addition to doing over 100 interviews for this project, a lot of my work was simply time in the field doing ethnographic work with these kinds of collector communities, both in habitat but also at conventions, at plant conventions, and I owe a lot of my work to their willingness in welcoming me into that community. Yes, I would say that the culture of that is very, very much changing. The rules, for instance, around presenting wild collected specimens for competition have changed. There's been, I would say, a major shift in the cultural tolerance of that kind of behavior within those communities. But you also point to the problems in particular that regulating these trades, especially plant trades, face, because just a few very single bad actors can have a devastating effect on rare and
Right.
endangered plants in the habitat. So for instance, by way of example, one of the people who was involved in the original succulent poaching of farinosa from California, who eventually fled the country, was recently last year caught in South Africa stealing tens of thousands of conophytum plants. And there's probably law enforcement on the call who can speak to the fact that I believe he was extradited to the United States to face charges. But you know, this is one bad actor who can have a devastating effect on these communities, right? So it's a challenge in the sense that I would say overwhelmingly within these cultures of these succulent societies, there's been a huge shift away from tolerating that kind of behavior. At the same time, I also know at a lot of these conventions, there are always the parking lot and under the table sales that are happening. So
Right.
while it might not be any longer acceptable, for instance, to show and compete with a clearly wild harvested plant, it doesn't mean it's also not potentially still happening in those spaces.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting because we had Pediocactus knowltonii back in, that was discovered or described in like 1981. It was listed under the Act in 85. And I mean, it's the same sort of thing. They had seed ready to go, plants in the market. And so it's saying to me that it's not changed in 40 years. And it might even be getting worse. I can't tell. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. We do have some more questions in the chat here. I'll read them off. There's a follow-up question on the pricing, about aspirational pricing creates a problem for law enforcement and sentencing. Value is critical in the U.S. for sentencing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a challenging one. And I would say that, you know, especially when you see prices for things for sale, for instance, on eBay and things like that, they're probably much more accurate. When I was sort of referring to the sort of aspirational and negotiated prices, this in particular is happening within more selective spaces, especially I found within certain Korean plant trade networks, but where those people always said that invariably they're almost always actually working with brokers who are specifically working on behalf of clients. So that's like a really pretty impressively niche sector in terms of thinking about that problem of value, but I can see how it raises a problem for sure.
Right. The next comment or question is whether there's any historical evidence that plant collecting for commercial purposes has ever prevented any extinctions, South African cycads, for instance. And then we had a follow-up to that is, are you asking about extinction in the wild or total extinction of species? So the questioner says total extinction. So,
you know, I'm sure there's someone else on this call who can answer this better than I can, in the sense that there are a couple of examples where there were new species where a few new species have been described, where interventions were made by scientists with policymakers to rapidly do their best to cultivate those species. To cultivate those species and then make them available in the commercial market to ideally reduce demand. There are a couple of case studies of that. I'm not sure if there's been a rigorously assessed, I'm not aware of a rigorous assessment that demonstrates that for the case of any particular succulents, however.
This is Mark Alvin. I just wanted to kind of comment on that. I would argue that the extinction in the wild is the important aspect here, that the total extinction is immaterial, because once the plants are gone from the wild, I mean, it's no longer going to be able to evolve and continue and survive.
Sure. Oh, Patricia, you're muted.
Okay, thanks, Mark, for that comment. The next item in the chat box is from Kimberly Freimeyer, and I'm sorry I didn't announce the other folks who asked questions before. She says it's still true here in New Mexico, sadly, according to my sources in the New Mexico Plant Society, not as formal as it once was, but it's now more bragging rights than still having those rules.
Yeah.
I think the next comment also points to another, driver from John Knapp, who says that he's heard botanists from botanists in Mexico that Dudleya poachers are collecting for perceived cancer treatment in China, and that the wild plants are considered to be more potent. Cancer-fighting properties of Dudleya was mentioned in a 1970s journal article. That is another driver.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I will admit I have not come across that that narrative, and I'm interested to learn about it, and I'd certainly be interested in trying to follow up to see if I can try to actually find evidence of that, but I have not come across that particular narrative, no.
Okay. I'm sure that person will be happy to get in touch with you. I hope he does. We have the next question from Leah Oliver, which is who's at NatureServe. And her question is, how do you think your data should or could inform threat assessments for the IUCN Red List or NatureServe's global conservation ranks?
That's a really important and valuable question. And it's one of the challenges that also comes with trying to find ways of integrating more qualitative data into these kinds of assessments. I think I would love to think more about that question and also be in touch about it, because I think that there certainly should be ways in which that could happen. But of course, again, because of the emphasis and time I've been putting into really kind of add deep texture and context to these studies, for instance, doing larger quantitative surveys is not something I've been doing, although I am beginning this online survey, at least to get a better sense of, within the broader community of these cactus and succulent societies, how people personally, currently feel about these kinds of trade regulations, and thinking about their sense of acceptability around, wild harvested plants and things like that. But yeah, it's an important question. I'd like to think more about that.
Okay, I do have a few more questions in the chat, and I noticed that we are at 3:30, but I think we can continue on for a bit to just finish up this Q&A. And I bet you there's going to be a lot of people who get in touch with you after this
which would be
presentation. Great. We have a question here, or a question from Carly Stepp. I'm not sure what the affiliation is there, but it says, what are your thoughts about allowing legal harvest of species like ginseng in the Southeast? Is this helping decrease illegal harvest or only increasing demand?
That's a good question. I'm going to start by saying that I have not studied the ginseng trade, and so everything I say after that needs to be taken with a grain of salt. I do think that focusing on demand side is really, really crucial and important, because we know from a variety of instances why supply side interventions often do not have the intended outcomes that we desire. So in that context, I do think that there needs to be a focus on thinking about the sustainability of trades rather than thinking only about ways of completely eliminating them. But I'm very practical in that sense.
Okay, thank you. The next item is from Nick Jensen, who's with the California Native Plant Society. Nick says that just this week, California Assembly Member Chris Ward introduced legislation sponsored by the CNPS aimed at stemming the poaching of Dudleya through increased penalties for removal of Dudleya from the wild. And I think this kind of gets to what you were just mentioning. Do you think this will aid in deterring future poaching activities?
If we look to the literatures from criminology, for instance, in critical criminology, and from other wildlife trades about supply side disruption and supply side intervention, there is very strong evidence in a variety of ways that supply side interventions do not have the intended outcomes of necessarily reducing those activities, but oftentimes making them moved further underground, potentially more dangerous, potentially involving the incorporation of more dangerous actors into those spaces who are more willing to take risks against more severe penalties. I think in the case of Dudleya, the more important thing to focus on is encouraging, for instance, the fact that there are greenhouses, for instance, doing sustainable cultivation of these plants in Korea right now, working, for instance, potentially with uh, Korean partners to think about ways that this lesson can be applied to other species. For instance, ways of intervening, for instance, in the problem of increasing conophytum and lithops poaching, for instance, from South Africa, to ensure that there is stock of these cultivated plants already out in the market as quickly as possible. I'm not suggesting that I can, I wish I could say for certain whether or not I think that more severe penalties will stop people or not, and perhaps they will have some effect. But there's evidence from other kinds of trades that the ultimate effect of that can be is introducing potentially more serious kinds of bad actors into illicit activities.
Okay, thank you. I'm actually going to throw a question of my own in here now. You talked about demand reduction campaigns and what they do, and obviously what their aims are. And I was just wondering, based on your experience with, these groups of species, in your opinion, what would you say is the biggest sort of missed opportunity from a social science or political ecology perspective when it comes to stemming illegal harvest?
It's a really good question. I think what I think about is how is it that we can leverage currently existing trade mechanisms to facilitate sustainable trades, especially that benefit countries of origin. So here, for instance, I'm thinking about ways of facilitating the development of sustainable cultivated plant economies, say in Mexico, so that people who are passionate about these plants have access to them in commodified form in ways that do not negatively affect the extraction of wild harvested plants. And this is such a difficult policy question. It's not a particularly sexy idea. I don't think that supply side disruption is the answer, especially when it comes to plants. Thinking about just the number of species, the amount of knowledge that's required, for instance, for border control officers to be able to even identify what is an illicit versus an illicit plant, for instance. Being able to identify seeds being taken out of a country is an incredibly complex and difficult task, right? Far more complex than in the world of managing and regulating animal trade. So again, for me, this comes back to the sort of brutal pragmatist perspective of how do we make sure that people are getting these plants that want them, and at the same time responding to the kind of cultures of plant collecting. What is it that we need to do in terms of intervening within passionate collector communities to really continue to push those communities forward in creating cultural shifts that say wild extracted plants are not something that we want to be associated with.
All right, thank you so much. So there are several more comments in the chat box, and I think we don't generally include those in the meeting summaries, but we could potentially grab them, and when we share the information back with this group who actually attended, we could include those chat comments if that would be helpful.
Sure.
I think it's time for us to turn to the next part of our meeting, and I would just like to say thank you so much again for talking to us about this really important and interesting subject. And I think, I look forward to hearing more, and especially about that collector survey. If you could share that with us, we'll definitely put it over the listservs if that's appropriate. And, I just want to thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Yeah, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Great. And if the rest of you would like to hang on, the last part of our meeting, and as well as Jared, is really just the Native Plants Roundtable, and that's where we open up the floor to folks who would like to make any announcements or talk about work that they're doing having to do with native plants and their conservation. So with that, I'll turn it to the floor if anyone has a comment. I don't know. You can raise your hand. I'm going to start by asking Peggy Olwell of Bureau of Land Management if her hand is still raised from the previous question, or if you do have something to report under the roundtable.
Sorry, I guess it's still raised. No, I don't have anything to add at this point.
Okay.
I mean, maybe I could tell folks that we are still working, and hopefully within the next month should see information from the National Academy of Sciences on the national assessment of seed needs and capacities, the study that they're doing for us on native seed needs. And that's it. Thank you. Sorry I had my hand raised.
That's okay. Fantastic. And while I'm waiting for other folks to raise their hands, I do have a message from our colleagues at the National Park Service who wanted to give some updates on some activities happening within their agency. First of all, they are working on an agreement with the Institute for Applied Ecology for native plant material coordination in the New Mexico, Arizona area. This is planned to be a multi-partner agreement, and they are letting the Institute for Applied Ecology coordinate this with other agencies at this point. I'm sure that'll be interesting for those of you from those regions that are on the call today. National Park Service is also working through issues to develop a single repository agreement and park permit language to promote the California Plant Rescue Project. And they say that they're in communications with BLM, with the Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Forest Service on this. Another update is the Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota has completed construction of a storage facility, seed storage facility, initially intended for use in a multi-park annual brome management project. Our National Park Service colleague also has their contact information, which I'm actually going to try to grab and throw in the chat. While I'm doing that, are there any other questions? Are there any other items to report? No native plant conservation events or anything going on this week? Oh, that didn't work.
Hey, Patricia.
Oh, hi, Gary. Thanks.
Hi there. So usually at this point, I announce the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History Botanical Symposium. So in addition to the excellent speakers we have lined up for the Plant Conservation Alliance, in May, we will be having a Smithsonian Botanical Symposium. The dates and the everything is still in flux, so pay attention to the email, and I'll be putting it out on the Plant Conservation Alliance. For now, we believe we will be having it over 2 days virtually, so instead of in person like previous years because of the pandemic, we'll be doing it virtually on May 13th and May 14th, 2-day period, and this is for the Smithsonian Botanical Symposium in conjunction with the U.S. Botanical Garden. The topic this year is going to be symbioses, that is cases in which two different organisms live together in some sort of symbiosis mechanism, such as lichens or mycorrhizal relationships. And you'll learn all about the intricacies and conservation and botany behind all of that. So hold the dates, May 13th, May 14th, and I will be sending out announcements probably next month to the PCA listserv. Thanks.
Thank you, Gary. Are there any other announcements? Just feel free to speak up. Okay, well, in that case, we do have a few more minutes, and I'd be happy to, I don't know if we still have the presenter on the line, if there were any final questions to the presenter that you'd like to ask. Oh, maybe the presenter likes to have has a question. Sure, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry. I didn't have a specific question. Apologies.
Thought you were raising your hand.
No, just signaling I'm here.
Okay, great. Oh, thanks.
Jared, can I ask you a question that sort of follows up on the someone made the comment that legislation went through in California banning collecting the species in the wild, and you made the comment that just banning it in the wild won't decrease the market demand. What sort of legislation can be put forward then that can reduce market demand? I mean, can we make it, I don't know, make it illegal to buy wild collected plants, but then how does the consumer know for certain whether a plant's wild or greenhouse spot? So I'm just wondering what sort of legislation can go forward to decrease the demand versus reducing the supply?
Well, off the top of my head, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I have an immediate response in terms of thinking about legislation. And I think that speaks to kind of the challenge, but also the call in all of this. I think about, for instance, the fact that 4 years ago, I had never heard of such a thing as illicit succulent plant trade. And I think what that speaks to is how those of us concerned and interested in this topic think about bringing this topic to wider fora, to broader audiences, to ask important questions, to develop cultures in which we ask questions about the sustainability and ethics of where these plants, plants, especially in the context of the pandemic, there's just been growing and growing popularity, especially amongst a younger and younger segment of the population for maintaining houseplants, for instance. And so I think growing awareness around asking questions about where do your plants come from is part of the work. And it's a bit of a fuzzy response to your question, right? It's not a specific piece of legislation. It's about how do we educate consumer groups. So for instance, when I met with Korean colleagues and folks who work in biodiversity conservation in Korea, and they asked me, they said, do you think a demand reduction campaign here would work? And in the sense that the Dudleya farinosa market is such a specific and specialized market that a widespread consumer demand reduction campaign would do very little to speak to the very niche collector community, right? What that requires is much more targeted discussions within those communities about how they value and think about where these plants come from. I was so surprised when I was in Korea to discover that so many of these people had very little idea of where these plants even came from, nor were they very concerned about where they came from because they were interested in its aesthetic qualities. But it also means that should be also seen as a good thing in the sense that it means that there should be a way of substituting that product then, right? So I realize I'm sort of punting on your question, but I think it also speaks to why this is also such an important kind of social and cultural question that you're asking.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm checking the chat because I'll just mention some of the comments that were there. I know that we had some of our Fish and Wildlife Service outreach people here on the call today, and I think they've left already. But that's exactly what they work on is demand reduction strategies. Yeah. And I think it's always very interesting to hear about new and novel ways of doing that. I think it's something that we turn to only just recently as an attempt to try to just not regulate, but also to figure out what are the drivers and address those.
Yeah, I'll just give a quick example. I was contacted by someone who owns a plant store in Baltimore, Maryland, who came across a conversation I had in a podcast about this issue, very alarmed and said, is it possible that I'm selling illicit plants in my store? And again, this was someone who works in the retail sector of succulent plants, and they had no idea that this was even a possibility. And they became very concerned, and they said, are there ways, for instance, I can check with my wholesale suppliers about what their sources of origin are? And so I think that again speaks to opportunities for how and where education interventions kind of need to be targeted.
Yeah, you make a good point. Several of the colleagues on the phone today and myself work in international trade, and those are the common issues, is that a lot of people don't even, a lot of people I work with, not in my program, don't even realize that harvest and trade are a threat because they don't think that way. It's just not part of what they do. But also, a lot of consumers just don't even have the general broad mass market consumers may not even have the concept of trying to find out if it's sustainable. Although what we've seen in the last 5 years, 5 to 7 years with the slow food movement, and as well as local food, local this and that, and just really understanding where things are coming from, I'm actually seeing more of that awareness within the general population that's coming from other aspects of natural resource use. And it, in a way, I mean, maybe I just haven't been around long enough. It does give me a little hope, because I think when the general public is starting to become more generally aware that this is even an issue, and that that it's an important issue, that's part of winning
Yeah,
this
no, I think
struggle.
I think there's actually reason to be optimistic, and I may be naive, and I do fall on the side of optimism often, but I think that especially looking at young, especially within, for instance, the cactus and succulent collector communities, it's in general, I find some of the older side of the sector that continues to hold on to these ideas of specifically attaching value to wildness in a way that I don't see with younger folks. And I realize I'm speaking very qualitatively here. And again, this is part of why I want to do a larger survey now, kind of based on this qualitative data. But I think there is reason for thinking that there's possibility for positive reorientation.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again. I'm going to turn to concluding for this session, but I'll just say that as I mentioned, we will share the summary notes and the chats from this meeting with today's participants. And since I hadn't mentioned that in advance, if anyone prefers not to have their chat included or any part of that, please just let Maggie know. I'm pretty sure maybe she can throw her email address into the chat one more time so it's at the bottom of the chat. We'll be happy to accommodate you. So now what I'll do is just talk about when our next meeting is. And as Gary already mentioned, it will be March 10th, and we'll be welcoming Dr. Thomas Easley, who will speak about relationships, history, hip hop, and forestry. And as Gary mentioned, we will also send reminders out about the meetings just before, a couple of weeks before it occurs, and do the same process. We'll have RSVPs and whatnot. The best way to stay informed of the meetings is through our listserv, which I'm having trouble posting because my things always want to be highlighted. I wonder if Maggie or if Mandy's still on, if you could post the link, because it's showing up really funky. So if folks are interested in staying abreast of our meetings and sharing information about the important work that you all do in the conservation arena, it's a two-way listserv. So we'd certainly welcome you to join the list. And also my last nugget to you today, I think that was it, actually. So with that, I'll just say thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our first meeting of 2021. I think it was really exciting. Great to have all of you here. And I hope that we see you again in March. Bye-bye.